Welcome back to Calm House Stories, where quiet women finally stop being quiet and family learns what loyalty actually costs. Drop a comment below and subscribe, because this one runs long and I need you to sit with all of it. Let me tell you what I do, because it matters later. My name is Maya Sinclair, and I'm a structural engineer in Denver, Colorado. I don't build the parts of a building people notice, I build the bones underneath them. Foundations, load calculations, the invisible math that decides whether a roof stays up in a storm or comes down on the people sleeping under it. 14 years of it. I've walked into buildings other engineers signed off on and found the exact beam that was going to fail, sometimes years before it would have. My colleagues used to joke that I could hear concrete complaining. When a building looks fine but isn't, I'm usually the one who notices first. At the office, they call me when the ground shifts. At home, I was just Ethan's wife, the one who's good with numbers. My father-in-law used to introduce me at family barbecues that way, hand on my shoulder, smiling, proud in the specific way men are proud of things they don't have to understand. Maya keeps the books straight. Everybody laughed. I laughed too. That was the arrangement, even though nobody ever wrote it down. I want you to understand how completely I had learned to take up exactly the amount of room that made everyone comfortable. My own grandmother, before she passed, used to say something to me when I was young and ambitious and impatient with the world. "Sweetheart, a house has room for one son. Don't stand where the light already falls." She meant it kindly. She meant it as a survival instruction handed down through generations of women who had learned that being indispensable and being invisible could, if you were careful, be the same skill. I carried that sentence the way some people carry scripture. I got very good at being present without being seen. The family. My husband Ethan was the younger son of the Whitfield family, a name that still meant something in the old part of Cherry Creek, thanks to his father Robert's furniture manufacturing business, built from one workshop into a factory that once employed nearly 300 people. Robert had died 3 years earlier, of a heart attack, at his desk, mid-sentence with a supplier on the phone. And by then, everyone assumed the business was simply resting, the way old money rests, the way a garden looks fine in winter even when the roots underneath have already given up. Nobody asked why the second production line had gone quiet. Nobody asked who was paying the workers who still showed up out of loyalty and habit, men and women who had worked those machines since Robert was young himself. Nobody asked who was paying the bank that hadn't yet foreclosed, or why the foreclosure notices had stopped arriving. Money in that family was like plumbing, assumed, invisible, somebody else's problem, until the day the taps run dry and everyone looks around confused, as if water was something that simply happens. There was an order to that family, the kind you could draw on a whiteboard if you were cruel enough to try. Chase, the older son, ran an investment consulting practice that mostly consisted of long lunches at the country club and a leased BMW he couldn't quite afford. Chase had a laugh that arrived in a room before he did, and a way of nodding seriously at business conversations he didn't fully follow. Ethan was the planet that had learned early to orbit his older brother, quieter, gentler in some ways, but with the specific weakness of men who have never once had to be the strongest person in a room. He worked in the factory's dwindling sales department, some months earning real commission, most months earning very little, and smiling through the difference the way he'd learned to smile through everything. And Diane, their mother, sat above the whole arrangement like a queen who had never once had her name on a single document, and never needed to. 62 years old, front pew at First Presbyterian every Sunday, a woman who had spent her whole life being served information rather than seeking it. Power in that house wasn't about whose name was on things. It was about who everyone turned to when a decision had to be made, and who got consulted after the decision was already comfortable. I fit into that family exactly one way, Ethan's wife, who works a lot. Nobody ever asked what the factory's electric bill cost that month, or who was quietly wiring money to keep the machines from being auctioned off in pieces to a liquidator out of Colorado Springs. Nobody asked who paid for the roof repairs after the 2019 hailstorm, or the lawyer's fee when a supplier threatened to sue, or the modest but steady salary that kept 9 of the old line workers employed long after there was any real economic reason to keep them. You're already wondering where it was really coming from, aren't you? Hold that thought. That's the whole story. What I did, and why I hid it. When Robert died, The family learned within a week that the business had been dying long before he did. Loans against the machinery, taken out quietly over 2 years. Wages 3 months behind, covered partly by Robert's own dwindling personal savings. A bank letter with the word liquidation in it, which Diane found in her husband's desk drawer and kept there, unopened for a second time, the way you don't reread a diagnosis you've decided not to believe. I found Ethan in the factory office at nearly midnight, 4 days after the funeral, sitting in his father's old wooden chair with his head in his hands, the desk lamp throwing long shadows across ledgers he didn't know how to read. "It's gone, Maya," he kept saying. "The whole thing. And Mom doesn't even know yet. How do I tell her the factory her husband built is going to some liquidator in Colorado Springs?" I sat with him a long time that night. I didn't say anything about what I could do. I just listened, because that's what the moment needed first. But driving home afterward, alone, my engineer's mind was already running the numbers the way it runs numbers on a cracked foundation. Not with panic, but with the calm, almost clinical focus of someone who has been trained to look directly at what's failing instead of looking away from it. So I did what I do. I ran the numbers properly, over 3 nights, at my own kitchen table, with coffee going cold beside me. And the numbers said something Ethan's grief hadn't let him see. The factory could be saved if someone acted quickly, quietly, and without sentiment. I had 14 years of savings from a career I'd built entirely on my own, a stake in a joint engineering firm I'd co-founded with 2 former classmates, and a modest inheritance from my grandmother that I had never touched, out of some superstition that it was meant for something important. I formed a small LLC, Meridian Capital Advisory, for privacy and liability, the way any attorney would tell you to. I used it to negotiate directly with the bank, buy out the defaulted portion of the loan at a discount, restructure the remaining debt over longer term, and quietly stabilize the factory's cash flow. It wasn't a fortune I was working with. It was careful, unglamorous money, moved in careful, unglamorous amounts, month after month, the way you reinforce a foundation 1 pour of concrete at a time rather than all at once. And then I did the strangest thing I have ever done in my life. I saved a family's entire world, and I hid it from them like a crime. Because of the office that night. Because of my grandmother's voice in my head. Because "Don't stand where the light already falls" had somehow, over the years, become "Don't ever let them see how much you're actually carrying." The family kept believing, because it was easier and because grief makes people believe convenient things, that some old business partner of Robert's, a debt of gratitude from decades ago, they said, though nobody could name him precisely, had quietly settled matters out of respect for the family name. I let them believe it. I never once corrected the story. Every first of the month, for 42 months, I moved money through Meridian into the factory's operating accounts from a locked laptop in the small office nobody in that house ever used but me. A narrow room off the kitchen that had once been a mudroom, which I had quietly converted into an office with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a door that closed properly. The small costs nobody counted. I want to itemize this for you, the way I would for a client, because the itemizing is the point. The restructured bank loan, paid on schedule. The 9 salaries I quietly protected when the rest of the workforce had to be let go. Men and women with families, whose kids went to the local schools, 3 of whom I ended up quietly covering supply costs for without ever telling anyone, including Ethan. The generator's annual maintenance contract, because Denver's winter storms don't pause for anyone's grief. The lumber supplier's credit line, renegotiated twice. The attorney's retainer for the supplier lawsuit that never had to go to court because it was settled quietly, the way I preferred everything settled. Roughly $9,000 a month, on average, moving out of my personal accounts and my share of firm income and into the quiet machinery of Meridian. Some months more, when a machine broke down and needed replacing. Some months slightly less. I tracked it the way I track load calculations. Precisely, without romance, because precision was the only thing standing between the Whitfield family and a padlocked factory gate. I did try to speak, once, in year 2. I sat Ethan down on a Sunday evening and got as far as saying, "The factory costs more to keep running than anyone realizes, and I've been covering a large part of it." Not even the whole truth. Just the doorway to it. He went quiet for 2 full days. Then he came to me and said, gently but firmly, "Maya, please don't make Mom worry about money right now. She's still grieving Dad. Whatever it is, if you can manage it, manage it. We'll figure out the rest later. That same month, Diane's blood pressure spiked badly enough that she spent 2 nights in the hospital under observation. The doctor's instructions were explicit: minimal stress, minimal shock. Every time I reached for the door, life stood in front of it, the way it does. So I did what capable women do everywhere, every day. I kept the system running and told myself the silence was love, and mostly, in those early years, I believed it. The dinner. The end began, as these things often do, over food. A Sunday dinner where Chase and his wife Brianna announced, over a very carefully chosen dessert, that Brianna was expecting the first Whitfield grandchild. Diane rose from her chair like a verdict was being delivered specifically upon her, hand pressed to her chest, eyes already wet. The first grandchild of this family, she said, as though Chase had personally invented the concept of continuing a family line. And then, over the course of the next hour, I watched the entire geometry of that dinner table shift. The way weight shifts in a room when someone stands up too fast. Every sentence bent toward the baby. The nursery. The legacy. The future. And the future, it became clear, had an address. Diane's eyes kept drifting around that dining room, the caretaker's cottage behind the factory, where we'd all lived at different points, where I had lived, in fact, the longest and most steadily of anyone, because I liked being close to my work and because, frankly, I had quietly renovated that cottage myself, replacing the old plumbing, the cracked tile, the water heater that never worked properly under Robert's original setup. A baby should grow up close to his father's business, Diane said. Patting my hand in that particular way older women pat the hands of younger women they've already decided not to consult. Maya, you work so much, honey. Some women are simply built for career, not for this kind of settling down. I said, quietly, that Ethan and I had actually been trying for a family too, for over a year. I said it softly, which was, in miniature, my entire problem. It disappeared into the clink of serving spoons as though I'd said nothing at all. Nobody was cruel that night. I want you to understand that clearly, because it's the part that took me the longest to accept. Nobody had to be cruel. The order of things was doing all the work on its own. The sun, the planets, the wife who works a lot, seated at the end of the table near the kitchen. Then, in front of everyone, with the ease of a woman rearranging furniture in a house she's certain is hers, Diane said, "The cottage needs to go to Chase's family now. Ethan, you two should find a nice place closer to downtown. You'd be more comfortable there. This isn't really meant for 2 people anyway." I looked at my husband. I want you to know I waited for him. The way I'd waited 9 years for a version of this moment to go differently. Ethan looked at his mother, then down at his plate, then finally at me, and he said the sentence I will remember for the rest of my life. "Maybe it's simpler this way, Maya." Not one person in that room asked me a single question. Not what do you think? Not is this all right with you? Not even where would you go? The cottage they were casually reassigning was a cottage I had quietly rebuilt with money nobody had ever thought to ask about. And I was the only person at that table who knew it. What I did next? I didn't argue that night. I went home, if you could still call it that, and something in me went very still and very precise, the way a system goes into lockdown when it detects an intrusion it has been quietly monitoring for years. I didn't say anything. I simply began, behind my own eyes, to revoke access. I didn't touch the transfer that month. I let it go through as scheduled, on the 1st, exactly as always, because I needed time to think clearly and I have never once in my life made an important decision out of anger. But I opened my banking app that night and looked at the recurring transfer the way you look at a switch you've spent years pretending wasn't yours to flip. 3 weeks later, at a moment nobody was watching, I let it lapse. What happens when a system loses power? Nothing happens immediately when a system loses power. That's the part people never expect. The lights stay on, because the lights were never the first thing wired to the money. Week 1, the lumber supplier's shipment arrived smaller than usual, a quiet, almost apologetic reduction, because Meridian's credit renewal, due on the 15th, simply hadn't come through. Nobody at the factory connected it to anything specific. Supply issues happen. Week 2, the generator's annual maintenance lapsed unnoticed until the next scheduled outage, when the backup failed to kick in and the second shift sat in the dark for 40 minutes, machines idle, workers grumbling about bad luck. Chase, informed of this by the plant manager, said something vague about looking into it and did not, in fact, look into it. Week 3, the bank sent a formal notice, not urgent yet, but the kind of letter that precedes urgency, addressed to Meridian Capital Advisory, forwarded automatically to the factory's registered address because that's where the correspondence had always been redirected. Diane found it on the hall table, read the words payment overdue and Meridian Capital Advisory, and did not understand either the number or the name, because for 4 years she had never needed to. She did what she had always done with confusing information about money. She called a son, and let's be precise about the pecking order even in a crisis. She called Chase, not Ethan, and said, in the voice of a woman merely delegating an errand, "You need to look into this, sweetheart. You're the oldest. Your father would want you handling this, not me." And Chase, staring at the letter, said the sentence that started the entire unraveling. "Wait, I thought Dad had some old business partner covering this? Some old handshake deal." Silence on the other end of the line, because Diane had believed, in the comfortable and unexamined way people believe things that spare them effort, that some benevolent ghost from her husband's past was quietly keeping their world upright. The way Chase had assumed his mother or his brother had it handled. The way Ethan had assumed the whole arrangement simply continued on its own, like weather. Everyone in that family had spent 4 years assuming the ceiling was holding itself up. Systems fail quietly long before they fail loudly. The loud part was now, finally, scheduled. The discovery. It took 10 days, a college buddy of Chase's who worked in county records, and a wounded sense of family pride to find what had been public the entire time, sitting in plain sight in a Secretary of State database anyone could have searched in 30 seconds. Meridian Capital Advisory LLC, registered member, Maya Sinclair Whitfield. 4 years of filings. Every payment traceable, my name printed cleanly in the box marked member. Where absolutely anyone could have looked, had anyone ever thought to look. Chase, I'm told, stared at the screen for a long moment before saying anything. His friend had to repeat the name twice. Then Chase called the house, and I understand, because Brianna told me much of this later, in a quieter and kinder conversation than I expected from her, that the entire kitchen went silent when Diane took the phone and read the name herself. Maya Sinclair Whitfield. Member. The daughter-in-law she had gently, comfortably displaced from the cottage. The woman who worked a lot. Had been, this entire time, the ghost, the old partner, the mysterious benefactor, the whole invisible foundation her family's remaining dignity had been quietly resting on. My phone lit up that evening with calls I didn't answer. Diane, then Ethan, then Chase, then Diane again. I finished my coffee. I let the silence do what 4 years of speaking hadn't been able to. The meeting. I texted the family the next morning, one line, no drama in it, I'll come by the house Saturday at 11. Then I muted the chat and went to a job site inspection, because a beam in a downtown Denver building needed my attention regardless of what was happening in Cherry Creek. Saturday, I drove to the caretaker's cottage, a cottage I still, on paper, had every right to enter, and walked past Ethan at the door, past Diane seated stiffly on the sofa like visiting royalty, past Chase leaning against the mantel rehearsing something that sounded rehearsed, straight into the small office off the kitchen. My office. The room with my desk, my filing cabinet, my locked drawer, the room they had all walked past for 4 years without once wondering what was inside it. I told them everything, calmly, the way I'd tell a client about a structural failure. No drama, just the numbers and their consequences. The bank letters after Robert's death. The buyout. The 42 months of payments. The 9 salaries. The generator, the attorney, the lumber supplier. I laid it out in order, the way you'd lay out load-bearing calculations, because a story like this only really lands when the listener understands exactly how much weight was being carried, and by whom. Diane did not crumble, and honestly, some part of me respected that. She rose from the sofa with her spine straight and said, "You let this whole family live inside a lie. You humiliated us. You should have told us the truth." "No," I said. "I paid for the truth to stay bearable for you. You just never asked what it cost." Ethan said nothing at all. He looked at the floor, And I understood, watching him, that the exposure landed hardest on him. Because for years, whenever money came up, he had simply nodded vaguely and let everyone assume we handle our part. Now everyone in that room knew exactly what his part had weighed. Nothing. And that knowledge, once it exists in a family, doesn't go quietly back into hiding. I told them the arrangement going forward. Meridian would offer a proper lease, at true cost, if the family wanted to remain in the cottage. Otherwise, I would begin transitioning the property. I placed my copy of the keys on the desk, not as surrender, but as punctuation, and I walked out through the same door I'd walked through 1,000 quiet times before, except this time, everyone finally knew whose door it had always been. The checkbook. I wish I could tell you it ended there, cleanly, with dignity intact on all sides. It didn't. Pride, once wounded, tends to reach for the nearest sharp object. 3 weeks after that meeting, Ethan, humiliated in front of his mother and brother, freshly demoted in his own mind from provider-in-waiting to dependent, found an old signing authorization I had, years earlier, foolishly never revoked from a joint arrangement we'd once set up for household convenience, before Meridian existed, before any of this. He used it to attempt a transfer out of the LLC's operating account. Not a large sum. Enough to matter, and enough to be, unmistakably, an act of desperation dressed up as entitlement. My own systems, the same instinct that has kept fraud out of buildings and out of ledgers for 14 years, flagged the transfer within a day. I didn't press charges. I want to be honest with you about why, because it would have been easy, and in some rooms, satisfying. I didn't do it because he'd been humiliated enough, and because criminal charges would have followed him for the rest of his life over a mistake made in genuine panic rather than genuine malice, and because I had spent this entire story trying not to become the very thing that had been done to me, invisible, punishing, operating in the dark. Instead, I simply revoked every access point that still carried his name, the way you seal a hairline crack before it becomes a structural failure. Quietly. Completely. Without ceremony. Where it landed. The divorce, when it came, was quiet, attorney to attorney, no courtroom theatrics. He kept his truck and his pride, in whatever shape it survived in. I kept my maiden name, because frankly, I had earned the Whitfield more than most Whitfields had, though I chose, in the end, to simply go back to Maya Sinclair, my own name, on every document that mattered. The factory now runs modestly under a proper lease that Chase's side of the family pays, on time, because for once, everyone in that house knows precisely what things cost and precisely who is paying for them. Diane, I'm told, still tells a somewhat softened version of the story at church functions. One where I am less the woman who was wronged and more simply very good with numbers. Some habits outlast even revelation. With what came back to me once the factory's debts were finally settled properly, on the record, in my own name this time, I bought a small craftsman house of my own in the Berkeley neighborhood of Denver. No LLC standing between me and the deed. No privacy structure. Just my name, plainly, at the bottom of the paperwork, the way I had never once in my life put it on anything this important. The county clerk stamped it without ceremony, because to her, it was simply a Tuesday. To me, it was the entire war, resolved in one line of ink. Systems fail quietly long before they fail loudly. But a woman is not a system. And the day she finally stops running silently in the background is the day everyone around her learns, sometimes all at once, exactly what had been holding the roof up the whole time. If someone in your life is counting on your invisible work right now, make it visible today, gently, before the bill does it for you. And if you know a woman quietly holding up a whole house in the dark, send her this story. Drop your own in the comments. I read every one.